A life of favor, for I know who I am. I'm working in power, I'm working miracles. I live a life of favor, for I know who I am. A pleasant good morning to all our listeners, on radio, and all our listeners locked on via the internet. Blessed Wednesday morning to you. Today we're going to continue our discussions in another session of Leadership Plus with Reverend John Lewis. Those of you who were locked on last week would have recognized that we were having some technical difficulties. And we started discussing a topic called Riding the Waves of Culture. We'll be joined by Reverend John Lewis. He's here with us again for another interesting conversation. I know who I am. I know who God says I am. What He says I am. Where He says I'm at. I know who I am. Good morning, Reverend John. How are you today?
Great. Good to be with you again today. We trust that this will be another fruitful time together with you and our audience, viewing and listening for this important discussion on riding the waves of culture.
Right. So right now, as we know, the world, is essentially a global village, right?
Yes.
And managers are now faced with having to deal with different cultures and, manage across and be able to recognize the differences in people and who they are and so forth. Can you define for us what is culture?
Great. So we have a description by Clive Dimmock and Alan Walker. Culture is clearly a difficult concept to define. For example, it is distinct from but very closely linked to society. Whereas society is simply the system of interrelationships. They said that culture is the glue that binds people together through a shared common understanding of an accepted way of life that is distinguishable from other groups.
Okay, so can you tell us how does different cultures affect businesses or success in business?
Great. So once you have an appreciation for the differences in the different cultures, understanding their norms and their customs, we can better appreciate and understand how to work with them without much of the conflict and the distinctions that affect all of us in working relationships. Cultural diversity is not something that is going away tomorrow. It has always been here with us from creation and over the 2,000 years now. People of different cultures share basic concepts, but view them from different angles and perspectives. And that allows them to behave in a manner which we consider irrational or even in direct contradiction to what we sometimes may hold sacred. Nevertheless, we should always be optimistic about cultural diversity. The people and their behaviors does not suggest that they are weird or that they are ignorant, but it's just to understand that their traditions give them a different worldview and a different perspective to how they view life and business and church and organization. So it's really something that, especially now, that we have to have a great appreciation for, as we work with international organizations and intercultural agencies around the world.
Right. So you've mentioned that we must be able to understand culture, but would one be able to fully understand the culture of another?
We may not totally, but there has to be a desire to understand and to appreciate the cultures from which people come. Sometimes we are so set within our particular context that we are not willing to take a look of why persons from a different background or different nationality or culture
Mm-hmm.
behave a particular way. And sometimes we get very annoyed because some of the practices that we observe in attitudes and assumptions, but there has to be a deliberate effort on our part to have a greater understanding and acknowledgement that, of course, there are differences
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
all of us, even within our own national context. We belong to the same island or country, and yet, if we live in one area of a country or one section of society, we will experience differences. Um, the, the, the interesting thing is, we are not called upon to be totally unified in everything,
Mm-hmm.
but to have an appreciation for how people respond and how people behave. And
Right.
like we
Mm-hmm.
mentioned as well, that one of the factors that we observe readily is people's perception of time.
Time. Yeah.
And I believe we had used some illustrations of that, of
Mm-hmm.
how people from different cultures, but also in their clothing, in their apparel.
Yes.
Um, that's one just obvious difference that we might see in cultures as well. And then, of course, the different kinds of food that we enjoy. Um, what may look may not be the same from a person of a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
But so we have to have a wider sense of the world in which we live, and because we have to work with different cultures. This is a global village, as you know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and like we're even doing this virtually
Mm-hmm.
and in a distant way,
Yes.
and we're in different locations. In the same way that businesses are now run globally,
Mm-hmm.
and you can live in any part of the globe and still conduct business with an organization, with a company,
Mm-hmm.
within the church context. Um, and so they may not show up at precisely the time that you have set for your Zoom meetings,
Right.
but that sometimes is an adjustment that we have to make.
So managers are now having to dive into the emotional intelligence, be a little bit more wise, and even exhibit more patience, maybe than before. Could you
Exactly.
expound on some of the qualities that managers today are now asked to, develop or to use in today's culture? Yeah.
Well, as like you hinted at, patience,
Mm-hmm.
um, because you may set up a particular time, and if we're not careful, because of the different time zones we live in,
Mm-hmm.
it may not go out as correctly as we intend it to be, and so that can create some misunderstanding as well. I know for one of my courses that while we are doing a Zoom class at 10 a.m. in Grenada, it's
Mm-hmm.
actually 10 p.m. in Singapore.
All right.
And if we're doing a class here and we have um, students in India, for example, it's um, like, for example, today we did a Zoom training with some pastors already. It's 9:30 a.m. in Grenada, but it's 7 p.m. in Bangalore.
Right.
And so it's making those adjustments. I remember I was asked to speak at the church
Mm-hmm.
that starts 10 o'clock in India. It was like 2 a.m. In Grenada, which means that you either have to to set your alarm so that you get a nap and wake up back in
Mm-hmm.
time, so that their church that begins at 10 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
it's 1 a.m. here in Grenada. So time, of course, is a major cultural adjustment
Mm-hmm.
that we have to make as well.
Right. Could you tell us of other areas or other values that different cultures hold that impact business? We're talking about time. You did mention clothes, where, of course, but are there others that impact the success of an organization?
Well, mutual respect, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we're not careful, we can come to an organization with the air of superiority
Yes.
or feeling better than, depends
Mm-hmm.
on which part of the world we're living.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if we're not careful, it can be interpreted, misinterpreted as a spirit of pride or arrogance. And so, respect for one another um, in the different cultural differences that we bring will enable us to have a better working relationship. And in the context of discussions and negotiations, they would say that no idea is really a bad idea, but we put all of our ideas on the table,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a time for brainstorming, and then we filter through those recommendations or discussions, and then we come up with the best idea that would benefit our organizations, our companies, our governments as well. So a deep sense of respect for one another, and not a sense of superiority over one culture to another, because all cultures have their values,
That's true.
and but there are some fundamental values
Mm-hmm.
that if we are working together must be upheld. Respect, a sense of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
These are non-negotiable qualities. And so whether we live in the north of the world or the south or in the central part of the world, there has to be a sense where there is openness, transparency, integrity, honesty. Those are non-negotiable values
Mm-hmm.
that we understand and appreciate, and do not deviate from them, because those are values that rise above culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so we cannot excuse our cultural moorings or cultural heritage in lieu of the fundamental values and virtues that are necessary for good cooperation and productivity in terms of what we all do in a global society at this time.
Yes. It's very important that we pay attention to the cultures and the core beliefs of people. Because in reading the text and others, I recognize that, as we mentioned so far, that different cultures place different value on things. For instance, there is a culture that places value on what we've achieved, what we've done as a company or the product. Whereas there's another culture that is focused on relationships.
Absolutely. So there are some cultures who do not pay much attention, as indicated, to your past achievements, and they're not keenly interested in that as a value,
Hmm.
and they're more projecting into the future. What are we going to do? What are our plans? What possibilities in the future? And
Hmm.
so you could have some serious conflict of interest, where people want to highlight, the achievements, their credits that they bring, and some people could not, even be interested in those kinds of discussions.
Hmm.
More, they're thinking, let's go forward. Let's not, dwell on the past, but let us move to the future. But there has to be an appreciation. Look, this is your mindset. This is where you're coming from. So even though we may not have a deep interest, there should be, as we mentioned earlier, a respect for the value that people hold as well. We also to understand that when we work in a international and intercultural and a diversified globe, that we bring to us the common values that are necessary for productivity as well. So I think foremost that if we're involved in an international organization, intercultural movement, then there's stated objectives and goals before we begin to work together. So there is no confusion along the way that this wasn't clear to us, and sometimes you still have to clarify, even as you work together with a denomination of churches or a business company. We may have some things that missed our purview, but we have to constantly. But there are some ground rules that this is how we will operate. This is a platform in which we will respect each other, we respect one another, and this is how we will manage conflict.
Right.
Because in any sense of the word, with our great planning and initiatives and proposals, um, just the sheer fact that we are human indicate that we will have a certain amount of conflict in whatever we do. So it's how do we manage those conflicts as well? They will arise. There will be misunderstandings, perhaps misinterpretation of what we interpret what was written down ahead of time. And so there has to clarify, there has to be, let's clarify as we continue to work interculturally and globally as well.
You're right. So essentially, what we're saying is that the fact that you're setting objectives, these objectives will more or less create the culture or the values that the company or organization will hold and work under.
Absolutely.
Right.
So there are three areas in which companies and organizations focus on,
Mm-hmm.
and we mentioned these before. One is the human capital, the value of people,
Right.
and we said also that people put value on the planet and what's happening in the earth, and people are interested in what's happening with the global um, changing of the world in terms of its climate and the climate resiliency programs. And then other companies are clearly their primary focus is in the profit margin. And so these are considered to be the triple um, areas of cooperation in any company or organization. And every organization can determine what is their primary um, objective, what is really the bottom line of their companies. So, for example, you can determine whether people are the critical area of your work, or the investment is on the planet, or if it is on the dollar figure. So the book also described that there's no one best way of managing, and how some of the difficult dilemmas of international management can be mediated. Throughout, it will attempt to give readers more insight into their own culture and how it differs from others. So there are some areas that were covered in this particular book, and the cultural differences that were highlighted, and how people respond to these in these particular areas of the involvement. So they observed that primarily there are two broad cultures in the world in which we live. One is considered to be the individualistic cultures, um, deliberately assembled and contrived in order to serve individual owners employees, and customers. These ties are abstract, legal ones regulated. The organization is a means to what its actors want for themselves, insofar as they cooperate is because they have particular interests at stake. So in this individualized culture, each performs a differentiated and specialized function and receive the reward for doing so. It says authority originates in an individual's skills at performing tasks, and an individual's knowledge is used to make the organization instrument work effectively. So that's one predominant cultural phenomenon. And we've seen that we can draw some conclusions from some of the world culture that we have observed. It is said within the American context, it is described as a very individualized cultural practice where the individual is seen in preference to the communitarian cultures. And as we look at your own culture, you can learn, you can deduce how best your culture functions. The second dominant culture is what is called the communitarian cultures. The organization is not the creation or instruments or its founders as much as a social context all members share and which gives them meaning and purpose. It is said that organizations are often likened to a large family, community or clan, which develops and nurtures its members and may live longer than they do. And that's the difference between the individualized cultures. It says the growth and prosperity of organizations are not considered for individual stakeholders, or as we call them, gravy trains for top managers, but are valuable ends in themselves. So as we look broadly at the world cultures, we can see sometimes there's a sort of crossover in even within your own cultural context. But in most cases, one of these cultures is predominant. I think for us in the Caribbean context, and perhaps other cultures as well, it probably more so would have seen more like a culture in the communitarian culture in the sense where perhaps it was more so probably in the past where the community took care of you as an individual. You and I would remember that the community could flog you if you misbehave on the street.
That's true.
And if you, of course, if you went home and complained that you were flogged by someone in the community, bad news for you as well. So I think in some ways the community raised the child, the village raised the children, and perhaps the current generation don't have a clue what we're talking about. Our children, young people, the millennials, the generation that we come up with now, it is more cast in the individualized. Even among families, we are not seeing as much of a community among many of our families. So,
and that value has changed, even our language, because now we have the word selfie. Where
okay,
it's
okay,
more an individualistic approach. It was
you're
different
right.
before, but now it even affects our language and how we interpret different things. Yes. So continue with the different in culture. We were speaking of individualism and communitarianism. What are the others? Are there others?
Right. So those are in the broad sense, those are the two main differences in cultural. The one is focused on self and what they could benefit from being a part of a company organization. Even unfortunately, sometimes within the context of the church,
Right.
We may have individuals who, as we say, look out for themselves
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily for the community.
Right.
So we have to understand that, because if we go back from the biblical perspective and the biblical worldview,
Mm-hmm.
if we take it in the New Testament, when the church was founded,
Mm-hmm.
that the build itself and the
All
picture
things are
presented
common.
for us
Yeah.
was a church in community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in Acts chapter 2, 42 to 48,
They had all things in
the
common.
great,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's
Yeah.
the saying that
Mm-hmm.
encapsulates the perspective
Right.
of how the church was meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the values of the church then. And I believe there's still those values held within the church context.
Mm-hmm.
But in some cases, we may have moved away from those kinds of things. Fellowship, sharing with one another, those who were in need. There were a sense of otherness, rather than the self-centeredness, in terms of what we experience in the communities around us.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we break out of this self-centeredness?
Right.
And unfortunately, this um, self-interest
Mm-hmm.
that tend to pervade our world,
Right.
um, because it is when the culture clashes with the biblical worldview.
Right.
So there is that worldview that says, look out for number one.
Hmm. Right.
You're the most important thing in the
Mm-hmm.
world.
Mm-hmm.
While as from the Christian perspective, the other person,
Be
and
the
care
best.
for others, and a sense of love and affection for others' well-being,
Mm-hmm.
is from a Christian and biblical worldview. And sometimes there's a clash of cultures, when in a workplace,
Mm-hmm.
in businesses, in governments,
Mm-hmm.
and how people perceive one another
True.
and perceive the kind of involvements that we engaged in, and how do we model that from a biblical worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, when hopefully we model those concepts of community and sense of care and otherness, that sometimes it confuses other people. Why are you not giving back the same treatment or the same response to people
Mm-hmm.
who may have mistreated you or may have embarrassed you? Why are you not reacting, like we said, tit for tat,
Yeah. Eye
but
for an eye.
you an eye for an eye, but rather you're demonstrating that your worldview is totally different,
Mm-hmm.
than from what is customarily a non-Christian worldview. And so people need to understand the difference, and they might even ask the question, what causes you to respond differently? And you have an opportunity to explain or to provide an answer,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of, where do you get your value from?
Yes.
Where do you get your point of reference from? And we can always point back to, for us from a Christian perspective, there's the teachings of Jesus Christ, the
Mm-hmm.
greatest leader that ever existed,
Mm-hmm.
and how
Mm-hmm.
we as leaders, in our own context, in our own times in which we live, demonstrate those virtues and those values that
Mm-hmm.
enable us to live out this faith that we talk about. And it is a lot easier to speak about them than to put them in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's a daily challenge for all of us. How do we respond to the criticisms, the downplays, the disrespect that sometimes you may feel,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how do you, as a Christian person, respond to that in a godly way that says, my worldview is different. I am responding to you as Christ says. And sometimes the commands are not easy to keep. Talks about loving your enemies, those who do not
Mm.
like
Mm.
you, how you should respond to them, those who do not show respect for you or appreciation for your work. Um, and how do you, in this culture,
Right.
respond to the the conflict you experience from time to time.
Right. We mentioned there when a culture or organization comes together, they're basically forming a culture. And we know that within cultures there are subcultures. Now we're referring to the church. How can you, or any other organization really, how do you manage the different cultures under that one culture? I know it may take some time, but how do you, as a manager, deal with the different cultures that may emerge in your organization?
Great, that's an interesting question. When we look at the church in its true sense of the word, there's only one church, of
Mhm.
course. And of course, there are different denominations, and we call ourselves, by different associations that we have. And so the different practices and different norms within church structures and church organizations. And we may not totally agree with everything that is practiced or what is considered to be biblical. Um, and so that can create a sense of antagonism or create a sense of disharmony.
Mhm.
Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the things that we may disagree on are not necessarily the fundamentals to biblical understanding, but they tend to stand on the periphery or negotiables. Sometimes it has to do with style of worship, style even of practices that you imbibe within your own particular denomination or congregation. And unfortunately, some of these practices may be a carryover from some of the traditional customs that are within a nation or may have been brought over from ancestral practices that we are not aware of. And very often, those are not the fundamental practices that will cause us, um, in our context of the Christian faith, to lose our salvation, as it were.
Mhm.
But sometimes we allow those incidentals to divide us in such a way that we're not willing to put aside those incidentals
Mhm.
and disallow us and from working together as a body of
Mhm.
Christians, as a fellowship. Um, and sometimes people ask, how many churches are there in your country? And normally we would respond to the numbers of congregations, whether it's 200, 300, 500, 1,000 or so. But the real accurate and correct answer is there's only one church,
Mhm.
and that
That's right.
is the church of Jesus Christ that he has built.
Mhm.
And sometimes we try to correct practice, and it creates further disagreement or conflict. And sometimes it comes as a result of misinterpretation of scripture, or we may pick um, from a biblical perspective a particular line, not even a complete verse or a complete passage that
Mhm.
helps to explain the context in which we are speaking from.
Right. Okay. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Reverend John Lewis, and we've been establishing the fact about culture, and we've established that culture is a dominant pattern of living and thinking and believing that developed and is transmitted by people consciously or unconsciously. Those are values, cultural values. And we have been talking with Reverend John Lewis for the past 35 minutes. And if you have any questions as it relates to culture in your organization or culture on a whole, please feel free to send in your questions on 403-1031. Reverend John, can you hear me? We seem to have lost a bit of our audio. Can you hear me now? All right, let's see if we can address that little issue. Stay tuned. Don't unlock. Stay locked on to Hope 103.1 FM. Thank you for staying locked on to Hope 103.1 again, 1 FM. Reverend John Lewis joins us again.
Thank you.
So just before that
Uh,
slight interruption, the text does say that culture diversity will never leave us, or cultural diversity is
yes,
not something that's going
yes.
away really tomorrow, and it's essentially speaks to planning and enabling strategies on the assumption of mutual understanding. Could you further enlighten us on the importance of each person being able to understand, the organizational culture or what it is that the company is setting out to do?
Right, and sometimes that's very hard work because it has to be an honest appreciation that we are different, that
Well, we seem to be having some technical difficulties again. These are the challenges of the time. But we will be patient. Yes. Can you hear me clearly, Reverend John?
Yes, thank you.
All right, great.
This
So you
sounds
may have to repeat the things you've been saying for the past maybe 3 or 4 minutes if you can.
okay, that's
You may
fine.
have to repeat it.
Okay,
Yes.
so we were saying that, have an appreciation of how do we deal with conflict,
Mm-hmm.
because even within the same culture, we have conflict and confrontation, which is a part of growing and learning.
Yes.
And we try to separate the issue from the person. And sometimes you're not very good at handling this or deciphering this out. And so
Mm-hmm.
the people involved in the conflict feels attacked or threatened rather than separating what really is the issue
Mm-hmm.
from the individual. And sometimes, so we come away from handling conflict, managing conflict well, and leaving each person or persons involved in this conflict with their self-respect.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not, embarrassing, denigrating the person, making the person look small, as we would say. But
Right.
we all come away from dealing with these differences and
Mm-hmm.
misunderstandings, um, that we have come away and everyone has been in a win-win situation and does not cause further deterioration in the relationships,
Mm-hmm.
in the business or church even, because church, as we know, is not isolated from
Right.
conflict as well. Governments, business, church communities, even as we have been talking about another intelligence, marital intelligence. And I know
Yes.
that you've been on the call as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
And
Yes.
how do we help couples work through
Mm-hmm.
their conflicts and understanding and appreciation your spouse? I trust that we have learned a lot from these sessions
Mm-hmm.
and that we can handle our individualistic conflict a little better. Just a side note on this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because we all view the same thing differently. And these
Right.
things do affect organizations, and sometimes a behavior might just be as a result of how the person perceive uh, a particular thing. It may not be wrong, it just may be different to how you see it, basically
Yes,
because of a cultural value, and the language and the jargons and the emotion expressed around the issue.
absolutely.
Yes. So could you continue with us on diversity or culture as it relates to an organization and how we should handle it?
Great. So, in some practical ways, um, planning and organizing is a challenge. And of course, when you get into a boardroom or get into committees, get into cabinets or wherever you function as a leader,
Mm-hmm.
um, you will experience differences of opinions. But that's
Yes.
just normal. It's a normal way to people come with their backgrounds, they come with their differences of opinions,
Mm-hmm.
and very often you'd find in any group a dominant personality
Mm-hmm.
that tries to take over your meetings, and hopefully that's not the chair of your meeting, but that you have other people who can help manage your meetings.
Right.
So there's respect around the table for
Mm.
diversity of opinions. As a matter of fact, it brings a certain richness and breadth, and just bring together the
Mm.
various aspects that all of us have a blind side of us
Mm-hmm.
as well,
Mm-hmm.
and we do not see 2020 as we would say. 2020 is more hindsight than foresight,
Right.
and so even in our natural environment of work or even ministry, in our families, and how do we handle those distinctions, and actually use them as a point of strength rather than a point of weakness. Because generally we are all wired negatively, and so how do we come to the situations or companies, organization, church, and to look always for the best in one another. And so we emphasize what is good about this argument, what is good about it, rather than to knock it down and throw it out the window, as we would say. And so we emphasize the benefits of this discussion, and so that all of us would come out with a more productive and fruitful discussion that would benefit our organizations and companies. But diversity is a good thing, yes, and differences are good things as well, because we all come with our strengths. Of course, we do come with our weaknesses, and so how do we capitalize on the skills and the experience and the training that we've all bring together to make something functional,
Right.
and to be productive in the long run.
So a manager must, as we will have discussed in previous discussions, he must be aware of what each person possess, what they hold, their qualities, their values. Be aware of who they are as persons, and then the plans that will be made is ultimately to achieve unanimity or unity and the objectives set by the company. The manager has to take into consideration everything that everyone brings. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And ignoring that could be bad, right?
Yes, yes. So there is always the constant desire to respect differences of opinion, and to bring the beneficial side of these discussions together, that we can all learn from. And in any good company organizations, there has to be a sense where there is somebody who is skilled to look at some issues that we have overlooked and may not have evaluated properly before plunging into a decision that will affect many people. And so if that is not done carefully, we can suffer the result of a bad decision.
Right.
So that takes a maturity, it takes understanding, appreciation of all the different personalities and the different styles of leadership. Something that we perhaps will talk about in another broadcast,
Yeah.
because all leaders, there are different kinds and styles of leadership, and there are the strengths and weaknesses of those styles of leadership as
Right.
well.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have been discussing culture with Reverend John Lewis, and as he just alluded, we will have to continue this conversation on the different styles of leadership. And it's important that as we deal with different peoples across cultures, that we are aware who we are, because certain biases within us may hinder us from dealing properly with another culture. Yes, so we have to be aware of who we are, work on ourselves, be aware, and be aware of who we're working with, and so as to bring success to the organization. Before we go, Reverend John, is there anything else you would like to add?
Great. That just to re-emphasize that we experience these different cultural um, differences that we bring into this world. We look differently, we speak differently, and we act differently as well.
Yes.
And so, how do we um, appreciate that, and work on the strengths that enables us to have a very worthwhile and fruitful and productive life within our churches, within our companies, even within the wider sections of ministry that we're involved in this time of Zoom meetings, in times of discussions online. Um, so that takes a level of work and appreciation as well.
All right. Is the You mentioned a little earlier about the marital program? Is You like to share any information on it? Is it finished? What can we look
Right.
for?
So it is, yeah, it is particularly that particular course we concluded last Monday.
Hmm.
But it's something that we encourage people who have been in the course to share with their friends and impart that within their own life and family as they may have. And so we will continue these discussions. We'll let you know of upcoming um, classes and sessions that we invite you to participate with us. Of
Hmm.
course, Guide is open to everyone that are interested in learning and experiencing the training that we have expertise that comes from all over the world. Of course, our guest lecturers are out of North America. They can live in any part of the world
Hmm.
and present their teachings to us. So this is a great opportunity that we offer through the Institute of Theological Education as well.
All right. So we want to thank you again, Reverend John, for spending this time with us and for being patient through, the technological issues there. So,
Of
ladies and
course.
gentlemen, thank
Thank
you
you.
again for staying tuned. And we invite you to stay tuned and lock on and keep it locked as we will be having another wonderful session next week, God's willing. Thank you for joining us and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.